while also limiting distractions the best we can. As you can see, technology can be uncooperative at times. If you lose your connection, please call in using the number provided in your registration email, and feel free to utilize the chat box to ask any you have. Lastly, if you're attending to receive CEs, I know a lot of people are, you must attend the entire workshop and complete the evaluation to receive those CE. So I want to now welcome we're so lucky to have with us today, Ms. Hollie Jeffery, founder of ACE Institute, an organization awareness, education, advocacy, and about the lifelong effects of childhood trauma. Its goal is to help others be the light, so survivors of child life. Hollie is a licensed master social worker. Last 20 years of her career working with and children who've experienced trauma, human trafficking, child abuse prevention and protection, child advocacy, complex trauma, and systematic reforms are Hollie's areas of passion and expertise, and you'll hear that in her presentation today. Hollie is a national speaker and trainer, and she's trained over 3,000 people during her career on child abuse, neglect, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child trauma. Hollie is a presenter at the Crimes Against Children, Texas, the largest child abuse conference in the USA. She's a visiting instructor at the Mississippi Law Enforcement Officers Training Academy and is an adjunct professor of child advocacy studies at Belhaven University. I'm honored to be able to present our speaker to you, Ms. Hollie. Stop sharing so that you can now share. Hopefully we'll have clear everything forward.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me? If you can't, let me know in the chat or somebody pop up and let me know. Awesome. Thank you, Katie. My name is Hollie Jeffery. I am in Mississippi. That's where I'm from. I live in the Jackson, kind of Rankin County, Mississippi area. I'm originally from North Mississippi, in a really small town up there. And just a little background about how I got into this. 21 years ago, I was a college student that had just graduated from Ole Miss, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I knew that I wanted to help people. I had a degree in social work and lived in a small town, and applied for jobs up to probably like 65 miles away. And I applied everywhere but Child Protection Services. And I knew that I didn't want to work for Child Protection Services. That was, my professors in school always told us these crazy stories. And I was like, there's no way in the world that I could ever go and do that. And so I was looking everywhere else. And 6 months in, I still did not have a job. And so I started praying, okay, God, obviously I'm not applying at the places that you want me to be. There's somewhere else that you want me to be. So open the door to the place where you want me to be. And y'all, we're all from the South, right? Y'all use the word y'all. I'm assuming I don't have to tell y'all what y'all means. Sometimes when I speak in other parts of the country and people don't know what y'all is. So y'all, and then all y'all, I have to interpret what that means. But y'all, Child Protection Services called me like 2 weeks after I prayed that prayer, and they said, we heard you were looking for a job. And so I don't know if y'all believe in divine intervention, but I believe in divine intervention. And so it was very weird for me that this guy that I don't know just calls out of the blue and says, I heard you were looking for a job. And I'm like, do you have a direct line with God? Because I have not applied with y'all. They did not have an application from me. I had never filled out an application for Child Protection Services. I didn't go online. I didn't turn one in person. Like, I did not want to work there. And they knew somehow that I was looking for a job, and they had my phone number. So that was very strange to me. I say strange. It was just divine intervention for me. The place that I didn't want to go work is the only place that called. They had my number. they should not have had my number. They should not have known my name. But they call and they say, we're looking for people, and would you be willing to come in? And so I did. And had it happened any other way, I probably would have quit within the first 6 months because it was hard and it was crazy. And it was just, it was a very uncomfortable place for me the first year or two. It really got me out of my comfort zone. I'm a person who likes to know exactly what it is I'm supposed to do and feel like I'm competent enough to do it. And when you work for Child Protection Services, you're thrown into, especially when you're 22 and 23 years old, you're thrown into some of the craziest situations. And I was not prepared for that, I'll be honest. And but had I applied, I probably would have quit. But because I felt like it was divine intervention, because I felt like this is where God placed me, I knew that I had to stay there until he told me to leave. And he told me to leave about 6 years ago. I had experienced everything that I needed to experience. I had gained the knowledge that I needed to gain. And I knew that the system was broken, and I knew that these children were traumatized and things needed to be different. Not Child Protection Services is broken. I'm talking the entire system. Just what it took me 15 years to fully realize trauma, how it impacts a child's brain, why we see the behaviors that we're seeing, why the system as it currently exists is not helping them thrive. And I had to go tell people what I had learned, because I remember being that frontline social worker that didn't know these things. And I am guilty of blaming and shaming and not understanding, and probably in some situations may have done more harm than good. And so today, I hope to take you along this journey where you have a paradigm shift, or if you've already had that paradigm shift, it just gives you some extra information and tools that you can use. When I decided to, when I decided, I've never had a plan, by the way. Like I worked in the front line, and then God told me to move to Jackson because I was in North Mississippi and I had my nice little life up there. And I really felt like God was telling me to move to Jackson. I didn't want to, but I did, and I hated it. But I love it now. And while I was there, they, when I worked for Child Protection Services, they gave me this unit to be the director of that I didn't apply for. That seems to be kind of a theme of my life. But I was the director of therapeutic placement for these kids. And so, just all along the way, I've never just really had this plan. And so about 3 years ago, I was in this situation where I was in between jobs, and I was like, okay, God, what do you want me to do? And I really felt like he said, I want these kids to thrive. And I really had to sit and think about, why do we do the job that we do? And I teach this to law enforcement. I teach it to Child Protection Services. I teach it to service providers. The big scope of all of this is they need to thrive. And how do we get them there? When I'm talking to law enforcement, they're part of their piece in this puzzle is justice. But is justice enough? I was talking to a lady the other day whose 4-year-old daughter had been raped, and they're 3 years past that, and she's not probably going to get justice, and she's devastated because it's her 4-year-old daughter's word against the offender's word. There's no physical evidence. There's a forensic interview, and that's about it. And they took it before a grand jury, and a grand jury returned a no true bill, which meant that man was not indicted. So this woman is devastated. I said, well, tell me about your little girl. How is she, with this? And she's like, well, it seems like this doesn't bother her, like she's okay. And so I had to have this conversation with this mom that because mom was just, she was angry and she was so devastated that even though you didn't get justice, does that mean you can't thrive? Are we just going to give up and hang up everything because we didn't get justice? Or is the end goal something bigger? And so that's what I've had to consider, and that's what I've had to work through. And so how do we get these survivors to thrive to their best ability? And what does that look like? Justice would be great, but at the end of the day, if you don't get it, is your life ruined because you don't have it? So then the next question is, well, if you don't have justice, what do you need to thrive? And so I'm still kind of on that journey, and I want to take y'all on that journey with me to start critically thinking about that. But before we can get them to a place to thrive, we have to understand how trauma impacts them. And so that's what we're going to learn about today. I'm going to talk a lot about child abuse and neglect, and I realize that you probably work with some kiddos and some adults that have delays that may not have actually experienced child abuse and neglect. There are other types of trauma, and we'll talk about those as well. But we are going to talk about child abuse and neglect and how it relates to adverse childhood experiences and the long-term impact those experiences have on children. So let me figure out which screen I need to share with y'all. Let's see. All right. All right, make sure y'all can see the screen.
We've got it.
Perfect, awesome. So trigger warning. We are going to talk about child abuse and neglect. And I am aware enough that there are probably people on this training that have experienced child abuse and neglect. And so some of the things that I talk about may be triggering for you. So I want to offer you grace. If you need to step away for a minute while I'm talking about something, please feel free to do that. I'm going to talk about all the types of abuse, and then I'm going to talk about some other in-home stressors that you might have experienced as a kid that may trigger some traumatic memories for you. So feel free to step away if you need to in order to kind of give yourself a break if you need to do that. As Davidlyn talked about, the mission of my company is to empower survivors to thrive. And I do that by giving you guys the tools that you need in order to enhance the gifts and the talents that you've been given. I believe, my personal beliefs are that all of us have been given some type of gift or a talent or a grace of some kind to do the job that you're doing. Some of you are graced with caretaking. Some of you are graced with counseling. Some of you are graced with system design. Some of you are graced with advocacy. Some of you are graced with teaching abilities. And so we've been given that grace, and it's our responsibility to constantly steward that gift to make it better so that there's an outcome that comes with it. And if you're working in this field, then the outcome that I think that we should be striving for is for our clients to thrive to the best of their ability. So that's the part of the mission. So part of it is for the survivors to thrive. I do that by equipping you with what you need. And when we steward that gift and that grace well, then we become a light in a very dark world. We're going to learn about what some of that darkness looks like here in a second. I tell people all the time that monsters really do exist, and they don't hide under your bed, but they may be in the bedroom next door, or it may be, you know, the teacher's assistant at the school, or it may be something different, but monsters do exist. They may be online. I do a lot of training for online predators, but monsters really do exist. And so when we take the gifts and talents that we have and we steward them well, and we gain more knowledge and more skill and more expertise, then we become a much brighter light in that darkness. And we can really have an impact, especially if we all put our lights together. And I always like to see it as a sparkler, because I can take my sparkler and light your sparkler, and you can take yours and light somebody else's. And eventually we're a whole group of people with our lights shining them into that darkness. So I hope today is beneficial for you guys. I've been doing this for 20 years, human trafficking, child trauma, children in foster care. I do child trauma assessments for children in foster care in Mississippi. And I do teach child advocacy courses at Belhaven University here. And then I have also the privilege of teaching the criminal investigators at the Mississippi Law Enforcement Officers Training Academy. If I had to describe myself, I would describe myself as a maverick, and that is somebody who does not go along with the group. I get myself into trouble a lot because I ask questions that nobody else asks. And I'm also the type of person that if something's not working, then I'm going to ask, why do we keep doing it? I'm going to be that person that challenges the rules. The rules may say this, but if we're not getting the outcome that we want, then I'm going to challenge, why do we keep doing it? I'm also like, I was talking to a guy the other day, you know, he had asked me out, and I told him that I was kind of a rule breaker, and he's like, oh, I like that. I was like, well, you know, I also wear mismatched socks, and y'all, that was too far for him, you know, but I challenge things like, why do we have to wear matched socks? I have so many things to do that, you know, I don't always take the time to match my socks, or I travel a lot and I lose a sock, but I still have the other sock, and it's a really great sock. And I have this other sock over here that's lonely, and I lost its pair. So why don't I just put those together? And that really bothers people. So that just kind of tells you that I have kind of a quirky personality, but I'm always challenging myself to do something different and not follow the crowd. The other thing is, a couple of years ago, I sold everything and I bought a 27-foot camper, and I live in a camper on the lake. And so these are some of the lake views that I have living in my little camper. And you can see probably my background. That's my living room back there. I'm currently sitting in the dining room, and that's about all there is to my camper. It's big enough for one person. So today we're going to talk about all the different types of child abuse and neglect and other adverse childhood experiences. We're going to talk about when children are exposed to these long-term, what that can do to their health, that can do to their development. We're going to talk about child abuse perpetrators. We're going to talk about in hearing about all of these different things, it can give us ideas. The data can give us ideas about where do we need to implement our programs? Where do we need to change our system based on the information that we gather from the long-term impacts of trauma to make our systems better to reduce the impacts of trauma? So in the last 2 months, there have been 4 or 5 child deaths in Mississippi, and these children have all been under the age of 5. Just in the last 6 or 7 weeks. And several of these children had disabilities. One in particular, several of these in this picture, this lady here actually shot her 4-year-old. He was on Facebook Live asking for help, and then she turned the phone off, and then she shot and killed him. Let's see, there was one, I can't remember which one it was. There was one that was beaten to death. This one here, one of the children was autistic. There was a 5-year-old autistic child and a 3-year-old child. And the autistic child got out of the house. The parents were not paying attention. I think probably were asleep or something like that. And the 3-year-old got out with the autistic child, and the 3-year-old drowned in the pond, and the and the autistic child was found probably over a mile away. He's nonverbal. Neighbors didn't know who he was, didn't know who his parents were. So there was a search for the parents of this child, and an hour, hour and a half went by searching for the parents before they found the parents, and the parents didn't know that they were missing. So no one knows exactly how long the children had been gone, but we do know that the law enforcement looked for the parents for an hour to hour and a half before they found the house that the children came from. And when they knocked on the door, the parents had no idea that the children had gone missing. But they asked where the 3-year-old was. Law enforcement didn't know that there was a 3-year-old. They just knew that they had a nonverbal 5-year-old. And so then the search began for the 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old was found in the pond near the home and had drowned. And then the next case, this case here is probably one of the most disturbing cases that I've seen in a long time, and I've seen a lot, but you can Google this particular case from Tupelo, Mississippi. This happened in January. The child was a 5-year-old autistic child, nonverbal, non-ambulatory, was completely dependent on the mom for care. Was dead probably 2 days before anybody called 911. And I think the one person that called 911 was the 7-year-old brother. And so when police got there, this child had severe burns on his body. He had bruises on his body, and the autopsy showed that he had old broken bones. He had healing burns or healed burns on his body. She had taken a hot curling iron and sodomized him. She had taken a hot curling iron and burned him on his legs. So this child was tortured to death. And she would often utilize the brothers, the 6- and 7-year-old brother, to also torture him. They had no idea, what they were doing. They were just doing whatever mom told them to do. They would pull him off the bed by his legs. And she told him that if the brother makes a sound to hit him, and so that, they would. And eventually he died from his injuries, and she didn't even care enough to call anybody. It was the older brother that eventually called 911 and said, "I think my brother's dead." She was arrested, and she has a $1 million bond at this point, and she has been charged with capital murder, which is a death penalty sentence. So let's talk about abuse. This comes from the Mississippi Code. This is the youth court code for abuse, but most states have very similar descriptions of what physical abuse are. It varies slightly, probably from state to state, depending on what their statute is. But an abused child means a child whose parent, guardian, or custodian, or any person responsible for his or her support or care, whether they're legally obligated to do so or not, has caused or allowed to be caused upon the child some type of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, emotional abuse, and we'll talk about what these other types of abuse are, mental injury, non-accidental physical injury, or other maltreatment. However, in Mississippi, physical discipline, including spanking, when it's performed by a parent or a guardian or a custodian, when it's done in a reasonable manner, shall not be deemed abuse under this section. Now, we can take that last description there and we can have a whole conversation for 2 weeks on what reasonable discipline is. And every time I do a training on physical discipline, it doesn't matter the group, there's always this heated discussion on corporal punishment. Should it be allowed? Should it not be allowed? We won't get into that today, but it's a hot topic anytime we discuss it in any kind of training session. But the key word here is reasonable. And in Mississippi, we have a specific criminal code, criminal law that talks about what reasonable corporal punishment is. And it goes down the list of if there are bruises, if they are this age, if they were struck in the face, if they were this age, if there were scars, if there were injuries. And so it kind of spells out, and most states have something like that kind of gives you specific details. If they're under the age 5 and you strike them in the face, regardless of whether or not there's a bruise left, that's criminal child abuse. And so you can be charged with a felony for striking a child in the face or in the head if they're under the age of 5. So that's just kind of an example of what it would look like criminally. So let's look at some physical abuse statistics when it comes to vulnerable populations like children with disabilities. So according to research done in 1998 and in 2000, half of Child Protection Services cases across the country of physical abuse, half of the Child Protection Services cases of physical abuse involved children with disabilities. So we're talking cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, emotional disabilities, all of those types of disabilities and developmental delays. Half of the reports of physical abuse across the country involved children with disabilities. So let that sink in for a second. If we were face to face, we might could have a conversation back and forth, but why do you think they're more prone to be physically abused? Y'all are the ones that work with them. Sometimes they can be difficult to work with. Sometimes the caretakers have low tolerance, low frustration tolerance, low struggle with the ability to understand their child's delays. Just poverty. We'll talk about some of these in a second, but that's a very large number of children. When you think about half of the physical abuse cases in the US involve a child with a disability. It's very alarming for that population. And so, you guys talked about at the very beginning of this session before you introduced me about some of the advocacy that you guys do. This is really great data to take to the legislators and say, hey, look, this population is some of the most vulnerable when it comes to abuse and neglect. And it's not always because the parents are bad parents. There's a lot of factors that play into this, and we're fixing to talk about some of those. 37% of the cases, the abuse actually caused the disability. So that means that the physical abuse that the child suffered actually caused a disability. I've had a lot of shaken babies where somebody shook them and they had brain damage. And if it didn't kill the babies, it has left them in a variety of different states. I've seen them in vegetative states. I've seen them severely delayed across all domains and be wheelchair bound, on feeding tubes, and blind, and everything in between. And so physical abuse can actually cause some of the disabilities that we see. Some of the grandparents that may be raising their grandchildren may have their grandchildren because, someone in their home abused them and it's caused this disability. Physically abusive parents, what the research has found, what Milner and Peterson and Gable found, often blame the kids. They have unrealistic expectations. They may be insensitive to their children's needs, and they have some low frustration tolerance. So let's think about children with special needs. They have extra needs. They may look normal for their age, but cognitively they don't, they may be at a much lower age. So So it's very easy. I have seen over the years when I'm doing these investigations that parents often have these unrealistic expectations for what their child can do because their child looks normal. And in some cases, sometimes their child may seem normal, but they may have the delay physically or something like that. And so if you've got a parent that is stressed and has a lot going on, and they have that low frustration tolerance, then we're going to see a lot more physical abuse in those situations. Here's what some of the parental risk factors are for physical abuse. Single parents. Let's talk about single parents of children with disabilities. So there was this one particular case where we had a mom. She had 4 children. She was single. She was from another country. So she had no support system here at all. Dad had left because he was stressed out and just couldn't take it anymore. So he just abandons the family and leaves. 2 of the children are autistic. One is severely ADHD, and the 4th child did not appear to have any kind of disabilities at all. But one of the autistic children was a runner. He also had pica and would eat anything in sight. And on top of that, the school system had told her that they could only educate that child 2 hours a day, 3 days a week. So you've got this extreme special needs child who the school won't even keep all day long. So if the school's not even going to keep him all day long, who in the world are you going to get to keep him while you work? Because mom has to work in order to pay the bills. She's the only provider in the home. And so in this situation, some of these children came into custody. I don't think they all, I think maybe in the beginning, maybe they all did until a full assessment was done. And then several of them were sent back home, but this particular child stayed in foster care just because of his exceptional needs when it came to caretaking. We literally, as an agency, had to hire a one-on-one sitter to sit with him because when he was in placements, because if we didn't, he was literally eating everything in sight. And he was running and he would smear his feces on the wall. He was not potty trained. And he ended up coming into custody more because of neglect than physical abuse. But you can see how stressed she was. She would keep him locked in a room because that's the only thing that she could do, in, in order to sleep or to prepare a meal for the other kids. And I'm not saying she was right in what she did, but I'm saying that she was a desperate parent. Then we have limited social systems and isolation. What Cooey found in 2000 was that the parents who have challenges socially in forming healthy relationships, they tend to be more isolated. And the more isolated they became, they did not have a good social system to release their frustration and to vent their frustration and to assist them. And so you end up having these parents who don't have a good support system, and we see an increased number of children that are physically abused. We saw this during COVID. During COVID, when parents were sent home away from their jobs and they're stuck at home all day, and their ability to travel was limited, their ability to interact with their friends and family was limited, their frustration went up. How do we know it went up? We had more child deaths during COVID than we ever have. We had less reports of child abuse because the people who typically make the reports did not have access to the children. But how do we know the child abuse was happening? Because we had more admissions to the hospital of severely injured children or children who were dead. Prior to COVID, children who were under the age of 3 were more likely to be killed from physical abuse. During COVID, it was preschool children aged 3 to 6 that were more likely to die of child abuse. It takes a lot of force over a sustained period of time to kill a 3 to 5-year-old child. That was what was disturbing. So what the pediatricians in these child abuse clinics and in the emergency pediatric emergency rooms across the country, were finding was that we've got this perfect storm of situation where we have isolated parents who can't go to work, who can't get away from their children, who can't interact with their support systems, and they're stuck inside with these kids all day. And now we've seen an increase in severe physical abuse of these children, to the point where we had a number of children in that year that were killed because of child abuse doubled. Meanwhile, the reports of child abuse in most counties plummeted to almost 90%. So the children were not able to be protected, even though we knew that they were probably being abused. Poverty is another situation. All the research points to there are higher rates of physical abuse in poverty situations, but there's also higher rates of children with disabilities. In populations who experience a lot of poverty. And then you also have childhood history of abuse themselves. This is where the debate about corporal punishment always comes in. There's always somebody that's going to be in the crowd that says, well, my dad, whipped me, and that's the problem with kids today, and all that. And so that's where we have to go back and have that conversation about what is reasonable versus what is abusive. And so we look at the duration of the physical abuse, we look at the frequency of it, we look at the intensity of it. And if it keeps happening over time, at a high frequency, at high intensity, in high duration, then we realize that the risk to that child is much, much higher, and they're probably unsafe in their environment. But all of these are parental factors that contribute to physical abuse. And then we go back to this statistic here where it says half of the children in physical abuse cases are children with disabilities. So that tells us that a lot of their parents are single, limited social systems, and isolation. I think about my uncle when my aunt had Alzheimer's. There's a lot of elderly people who commit suicide because they are completely isolated when they are the caretaker of someone with a disability. And so if half of the kids that are being physically abused are kids with disabilities, and these are the parental factors that we're seeing over and over and over again, then this right here is where some of our systems need to design their interventions. And then here's the scary one. This is where children are probably going to have to be removed from those homes. And that's when you have a caretaker who has a complete lack of empathy for that child. They have a complete lack of empathy for the child's needs, for the child's delays. And if the child irritates them at all, and we know that children with special needs have special needs. They have extra needs. And if you've got a parent that just doesn't care, then what we're going to have is one of those situations where we've got this mother who just not only does not care about her child, but she actually enjoys torturing her children. We often see this a lot. Mothers and their boyfriends who are not the fathers are usually more likely to be the ones that physically abuse the children. Research shows that biological mothers and non-biological boyfriends of the mom are more likely to be the person who physically abuses children. And so, part of that has to do with the children typically probably live with the mom more often. Then you've got this boyfriend that comes in, this is not their child. And so there's a complete lack of empathy there for this child that's not theirs. Throw in other situations where they're isolated, where they're young, where they may have some delays themselves, low frustration tolerance. And then we've got a perfect storm for a child to be seriously injured. Then we have a neglected child. So we just got through talking about physical abuse. Now we're going to talk about physical neglect. So a neglected child is one of those children, and usually neglect comes from, oh, and I just realized that I have neglect misspelled. Neglect is usually in the home. Physical abuse can sometimes happen outside the home, like in a daycare or a school. Neglect typically, though, is going to be, especially extreme neglect, is going to be inside the home. So neglect is going to be a child whose parent, guardian, or custodian or other person responsible for his or her care neglects or refuses, when able to do so, to provide for him the proper and necessary care or support or education required by law, or the medical, surgical, or other necessary care for his well-being. However, a parent who withholds medical treatment from any child in good faith, from a child who in good faith is under the treatment by spiritual means alone through prayer in accordance with the tenets and practices of a recognized church or religious domination by a duly accredited practitioner thereof shall not, for that reason alone, be considered a neglectful under any provision of this chapter. So that what that is saying is, if a parent is refusing medical treatment, like contemporary medical treatment, like at a hospital or from a doctor, because they're choosing to practice their religion that uses prayer, that child cannot be considered a neglected child. But it's very specific in saying that it has to be a church or denomination that has a specialized practitioner who is performing this prayer over this child. So it can't be somebody that just says, oh, we're just going to pray it out. Well, they actually have to be taking the steps to do that. So we've had to go to court over several of those over the years. Let's see. Also, who for any reason lacks the special care made necessary for him by reason of his mental condition, whether the mental condition is having mental illness or having an intellectual disability, or who for any reason lacks the care necessary for his health, morals, or well-being. So neglect can cover a lot of different things. And, when we go back up here, it talks about they neglect to do it or they refuse to do it when they're able to do so. And so, I've had those cases where I had really loving parents, but they were delayed themselves, and they had special needs children that were born with extreme medical situations that those parents just could not comprehend. And those were always really, really, really hard for me, because you liked the parents. They were doing the best that they could. And in one particular situation that I'm thinking about, it was extreme medical neglect. It was unintentional. They were doing what they thought was supposed to be done. But the baby was failure to thrive. He almost died. He had a cleft palate that they didn't understand, and he had had surgery. And so they were supposed to be monitoring certain things, and they thought that he was doing good when he didn't. And so they were reporting to the doctor that he was doing great when he wasn't. And he was severely delayed and almost died because they just were not able to recognize the extreme medical issues. And so in that situation, they also had another child that did not have the extreme medical conditions, but because of their unintentional neglect of him, he could not speak clearly. He was 4 years old, not potty trained. He could not eat with a fork. He ate with, out of the bowl like a dog. So he was not enrolled in any kind of school program. He was not enrolled in any kind of early intervention program. They were living off of their SSI and kind of bouncing from place to place to place to place to place. So about the time they would get somewhere and services would get started, they would move somewhere else. And so they were moving to different counties or parishes. And so the services, it would delay services getting started each time. And so we ended up taking both of those children into custody. The older child that had just the minor delays in the foster home, he was able to catch up pretty quickly. The infant, though, we were not able to place back in their home, but the judge did place the older child back in their home. And we ended up having to terminate their rights to the infant, so that he could be terminated, because the parents then became a threat, to the foster parents, and a threat, like they were threatening us. And so there was fear that they would kidnap the baby and run off with the baby. But that baby ended up, as he's probably about 15 now, eventually diagnosed also with autism, severe developmental delays, will have to be cared for the rest of his life. And that, that's one of those situations where the parents themselves were delayed doing the best that they could do, but because of their disabilities, their oldest child developed disabilities because of them. And they just were not able over time to show that they could comprehend what was going on with their infant son's medical conditions, and their rights, had to be terminated to that particular child. So, it's always kind of a hard cases when we have cases like that. Their neglect was unintentional. Their neglect, well, if they understood what to do, they would have done it. And in this situation, they just could not. He had eight or nine different specialists, and they needed to be able to explain from one specialist to the next what was going on with the baby. And over a period of 3 years, they were just never able to do that. In one particular situation, he had asthma really badly. The other child had asthma really badly, the one that was placed back in their home. And this is kind of how we decided at this point, we probably had to terminate their rights. So with asthma, both children had breathing machines where they had to, do breathing treatments and stuff. And so we go out there. We're probably 2.5 years into the case at this point, where the baby had been in custody at 2.5 years, but the older child had been returned back to the home. And and we weren't sure that it was best for that older child to be sent back home, but that's what the judge felt like he wanted to do. So he did that against our recommendations. In this particular situation, it kind of, it was one of those hard cases where you're kind of torn with what was the best thing to do. But in this situation, we go out there and they're telling us that the older child had had an asthma attack, and he really hated wearing that mask for his breathing treatments. And so they just take the albuterol and pour it in his orange juice, and that it helps. And so we asked them if any physicians had told them to do that. And so they told us the physician's name that had told them that it was perfectly okay to pour the albuterol into the child's orange juice to treat his asthma. And of course, we call that pediatrician. She says, I absolutely did not tell them to do that. Pouring the albuterol solution into orange juice is absolutely not going to help the asthma. It's not going to have any effect on the asthma at all. And so we go back to them and say, well, the pediatrician, we know didn't tell you this. And they were like, oh, well, Dr. So-and-so did. Well, we went down that rabbit trail 2 or 3 times with them. But, at the end of the day, they were treating him with what they thought was working, and it was not. And with that older child, his asthma was not fatal, but with the younger child, it was. And so when we had that situation where they just could not comprehend and were not willing to learn, we could not place that younger child with them. When it comes to neglect, which brings me to this next risk factor, when it comes to child neglect, 67% of child fatalities are because of child neglect, and their younger child would have died. And it's a particularly increased risk for children who are under 8. So we have to be very mindful of the neglect and what's causing the neglect and what the parental risk factors are for neglect. And when we think about children with disabilities like this baby, he had a lot of extra special needs. You had to be able to recognize, like, some of the medicines that he had to have, you gave him every day at the same time. Some of them were as needed. And so you had to be able to recognize when he needed the medicine and what medicine to give him. And so if we've got parents who have transportation issues where they can't get the medicine, if we have parents who are isolated, if we have parents, like the parent who had to lock her child in the room, I don't think hers was an intentional neglect in the sense that she didn't have a support system there to help her. So she was, I think she was kind of desperate with what to do. But neglect can be very fatal when it comes to children, especially children that have disabilities. What the research shows is that 80% of neglect cases come from mom. And again, that has a lot to do with most children live with their moms rather than the fathers. It's higher in moms who are under the age of 35. And then if it's a teenage mom, then the risk is really high that the child is going to be neglected. Children who are under the age of 3, the most fatal injuries are children under the age of 5, and more particularly children who are under the age of 3. They're more likely to die of neglect than any other age group. And of course, we know that when a child is neglected, when they're not played with, when they're not interacted with, when they don't have their needs met, they're going to have those cognitive and physical and social and emotional delays. And that's going to cause so many other challenges. And then we go back to those parental risk factors that we saw in the physical abuse, and that's going to make them more susceptible to the physical abuse. So it's kind of like this vicious cycle. Then we have sexually abused children. Sexual abuse means obscene or pornographic photographing, filming, or depiction of children for commercial purposes, or the rape, molestation, incest, prostitution, or other such forms of sexual exploitation of children under circumstances which indicate that the child's health or welfare is being harmed. So sexual abuse can take all different types of forms. It does not have to be penetration. It can be touching a child for some type of lustful purpose. It can be taking sexually explicit photos or videos of children or asking for them. And it can be sexual battery or rape where there was some type of penetration. So sexual abuse also is one of those types of abuses that often can happen a lot outside the home. It happens a lot inside the home, but it's one of those abuses that's more likely to also happen outside of the home as well. What we know about sex offenders and child sexual perpetrators is that they tend to look for people within their social circle. So children who are being sexually abused may be abused by a dad or a boyfriend of mom's, or a sibling or a cousin or an uncle or the neighbor next door. I'm currently working a case out of Georgia where it was a teacher's assistant. This child is a special needs child. She has an IEP. The school has teacher's assistants that assist with children with these types of disabilities that she has. And so one of these teacher's assistants was a male, and he's an older male, and he was caught on video on multiple occasions sexually abusing her. She did not report that there was sexual battery or rape where he penetrated her, but he did pull her shirt up, he did fondle her on multiple occasions. And so it can be the perpetrators can be any body that has access to those children. What we know about child sexual abuse is that there are higher rates of child sexual abuse in children with disabilities. Part of that has to do with accessibility, gullibility, passivity, communication challenges, credibility. They're just easier targets. Child sex predators target children with all of those vulnerabilities. They're looking for the kid that's easy prey. They're looking for the kid that has those social challenges, that might be socially isolated. And we know that a lot of our kids are socially isolated. They may not have a lot of friends at school. They may not have a lot of friends at church. And so they're looking for that kid that's lonely and isolated. They're looking for that kid that may have problems communicating. They're looking for those kids who may be acting out. They're looking for those kids that nobody's going to believe. We also know that they're looking for older children. Now, younger children can be molested, but by the time they hit 12 to 13 years old, so from between 12 to 17, the rates of sexual abuse increase. So by age 13 or 14, only 25% of children have been 25% of girls have been sexually abused. By age 17, 38% of girls have been sexually abused. So there's an increased risk from age 13 to 17 for female children to be sexually abused. And if they have some type of disability, that really heightens their risk of becoming a victim of child sexual abuse. What we also knew, going back to child sexual abuse, COVID teaching us a lot about abuse and the rates and where it's happening. Again, children are at home. Sometimes they're mostly at home with family members. It might be siblings, it might be cousins, but a lot of times they're at home with those relatives. We saw a huge increase in the number of children contacting the sexual assault hotline. So they were not contacting the child abuse hotline, but the sexual assault hotline, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, saw a 50% increase in calls to their hotline, and a majority of those calls were from children at home saying that they were being sexually abused by someone in their home. So then we have also the psychologically abused child. So the Mississippi Code does not have a definition for what a psychologically abused child is. And I have found that a lot of states don't have a definition for psychological abuse. There's a lot of debate about what psychological abuse is or is not. And so what the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children defines psychological abuse is the repeated pattern. So it's not just this one time of somebody getting upset and yelling something ugly. This is a repeated pattern. So this is somebody that's doing this a lot with intention of a caregiver behavior or extreme incidents that convey to the child that they are worthless, flawed, unloved, unwanted, endangered, are only of value in meeting someone else's needs. Well, think about our kids that have these disabilities and have these challenges. There's a huge increased risk for these children to experience psychological abuse. Parents may not be hitting them across the face with their hand, but our caregivers may not be doing that. But a lot of times they're getting this verbally, or it may be somebody at school. Now this talks about a caregiver, but people can be psychologically abused at work. They can be psychologically abused at school or any kind of social situations that they're with, friend groups. And it's just this, we call it bullying when it's peers, but it's this intentional, repeated pattern that conveys to that person that they're worthless, that they have no value, that they're unwanted, they're unloved, unless they bring something to the table. And we've got a lot of kids with disabilities. They already struggle with self-worth. And here we have somebody that's important in their life coming into their life on a repetitive basis, telling them these things or making them feel these things. What we often see is that the psychological abuse, what Hart, Germain, and Brazzard, Saunders, Berliner, and Hansen, what they discovered was that psychological abuse often occurs from parents when they have unrealistic expectations of children. Well, what do we know about kids with disabilities? Parents often, or caretakers often, or school teachers often have this unrealistic expectation of what that child is capable of. And so when that child does not meet their expectations, then they're more likely to experience that verbal and psychological abuse, which is also going to potentially lead to more incidences of physical abuse. Often when you see the verbal and psychological abuse, you're going to see the physical abuse go hand in hand. That's where we have those caretakers that don't have any empathy. So when you've got a caretaker that doesn't have empathy, and then then you're probably going to see a lot of verbal abuse. You're probably going to see a lot more physical abuse, and you'll see more intentional neglect. Intentional neglect is going to be, they see that child's needs, but I'm going to intentionally ignore their needs because I don't care. That's the opposite of those parents I was talking about a while ago. They wanted to take care of their kid. They just didn't know how, and they didn't have the ability to learn how. And so this would be those parents or those caretakers that intentionally just don't care. And you'll see it in the school system too. It's not necessarily parents. It could be daycare providers. It can be school teachers, school personnel. They just don't have the empathy that's needed for that population of kids. I was talking to someone several years ago who just didn't have that empathy, but he was a special ed teacher. And the only reason he was a special ed teacher is because he couldn't find a job, and he was able to go in Mississippi and get a certification to teach. And he realized that he could make more money if he got a certification to teach special education. And I think he had like a business degree. So he had no formal educational training to work with special needs kids. He just got this extra certificate to go be a teacher for these kids. He had no empathy for them. He didn't care about them at all. You know, he bragged about all he did was provide them with coloring sheets and put this one kid behind a cardboard wall because all he liked to do was masturbate all day. And so he would just keep him isolated from the rest of the room and keep him behind this cardboard wall so he could, is like a refrigerator box, so that he could masturbate all he wanted to, and while the other ones just colored all day. It was horrible. It was horrible. He had no empathy for these kids whatsoever. And then we have those parents who struggle with substance abuse. And so with those parents, we're going to see a full range of the physical neglect. I've taken more children into foster care because of substance abuse, because of the physical neglect, than I have for physical abuse. Physical neglect is the highest form of child abuse and neglect. It's got higher rates than all of the other forms of abuse and neglect. Like I said earlier, you have more incidences of children being injured because of physical neglect, and then drug abuse is one of those reasons why we see high rates of neglect. And so you've got a parent who has a substance abuse issue, the child is neglected, then we're going to see an increase in children who have these disabilities. They're not getting what they need in the home environment, and so they're developing these delays because they don't have what they need from their environment. And then unfortunately we have parents who suffer from mental illnesses and their own trauma, and so that contributes to abuse and neglect and psychological abuse and things like that. So we've talked about the different forms of abuse, right? So and we'll talk about some other in-home challenges in just a second, but I want to stop for a minute. Before we can talk about the impact of trauma, we needed to understand what some of the traumas were. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what some of the traumas were, we're about to transition over into the long-term impact of exposure to those traumas have on us. So have you guys ever watched the show Alone on the History Channel? If you haven't, I suggest that you do. It's a really interesting reality show. And so what they do is they take these survivalists and they drop them off in the middle of nowhere. So it kind of looks like this situation right here. They're just kind of dropped off in the wilderness and they have to survive in the wilderness. And while they're out there, they have to, make them a tent to sleep in. And if they want something other than a tent, then they have to build it and chop it, the trees down. They can't have a gun, but they can have like bear spray. They can have an axe or some type of chopping or sawing or big knife thing. They can't have a fishing pole, but they can have fishing string. And so the goal is for them to be in this environment as long as they can by themselves. And whoever is the last man standing wins. Now, they're not put out there with other people. They're all about 10 miles from each other. So they're in their space by themselves. And the next man is 10 miles away. So some of them last 24 hours. Some of them last 6 hours. Some of them last 3 months. But the last man standing gets the money. Well, in this particular episode, there was this guy, and he was talking about all the different experiences that he had prior to coming on this show. He was talking about bear experiences and experiences with wolves and things like that. And he talked about when you're dropped off in this wilderness, you kind of have to have your radars on. So this is a warship, right? And so this antenna on this warship is constantly scanning the environment for the predators. Are there U-boats out there? Are there the warships out there? That antenna is always up, and it's always going back and forth scanning the environment for the threat. Well, that's what this guy was talking about, that to be in this forest, you have to be constantly scanning for the threat. He's always looking over his shoulder for the bear. He's always looking over his shoulder for the wolves. There was this one guy, he gets dropped off and they put him, I don't think that they have much of a plan for where they put people. They just kind of drop them off randomly. And so, but he was very close to a wolf pack. And within 12 hours of being dropped off, he tapped out and told them to come get him because the wolves, he could hear them getting closer and closer and closer. He was terrified. This other guy was talking about if he was to have a bear encounter, what he would do. Well, one night he has a bear encounter. He's walking through the woods at night. It's raining. It's storming. He's got his cameras with him, and they have to put cameras around their campsite so the cameras are always catching what's going on because they don't have cameramen with them. They have to do their own filming. And so he's walking through the woods and he's talking on camera, and he literally runs into a bear, grizzly, and it scares him. And so he takes off running. And I'm not much of a wilderness survivor. I mean, I can barely catch fish. I don't know what I would do if I had a bear encounter, but I've always heard that the thing not to do is run. I don't think you're supposed to run from him. But he runs, right? And he's only been there about 3 days. So he has not had time to chop down the trees and build him a little cabin. Like some of these guys get really sophisticated and build them a cabin and all these types of things with, just a hatchet. Well, he hasn't had a whole lot of time to do that. All he has is a tent that looks kind of like this. And y'all, he runs from the bear. He knows the bear is chasing him. And he runs to his tent. And the bear comes. And you can see the bear on the cameras. And he is inside his tent and he is crying. And he's kind of like rocking back and forth. You can see the terror on his face. And I'm watching this and I can feel the terror. Like, I'm scared for this guy. And the outside cameras showed the bear running up to the camp. The bear is sniffing of the outside of the tent. The guy's on the inside. And the guy has gotten, you can just kind of see all these things happening. You know, his radar is up, like he's trying to listen to see if the bear is there. Of course, when he hears the bear, you can see the terror on his face, his heartbeat. You can almost feel it through the TV. Like, it's just a really intense moment. And when we have a moment like that, where we're terrified like that, our limbic system takes over. Our prefrontal cortex up here is our critical thinking brain. And when we are in a threatening situation like that, this part of our brain turns off. And our threat response, our basic survival, our basic instinct part of our brain in the limbic system takes over. And it's not always rational. It doesn't necessarily always do what we need it to do. It's going to run from the threat. It's going to fight the threat. It's going to freeze when they see the threat, or it may fawn. And fawning is where you do whatever the predator tells you to do in order to survive. And so in his situation, instead of freezing and instead of fighting, he ran. And running from a bear is not always the most rational thing to do, but he was running to get his walkie-talkies because his plan was to tap out. And so he calls the people to come get him. And typically it takes 15 to 20 minutes for them to come by air or boat. And so the people come back and say, hey, look, we can't get anybody to fly a helicopter out there because it's dark and it's windy and it's raining. So we can't come get you by air. And the waves are kind of big and it's raining and we can't get anybody who's willing to come and get you by boat. So we're going to come and get you, but we're going to have to hike into where you are, which means we're going to have to drive our vehicles to the nearest road and then hike in to get you. And from what it's looking like, it's going to take us about 4 hours to get there. Are y'all feeling the terror for this guy? He's just been told he's got a bear outside, and he's just been told we're going to come and rescue what's left of you. Because we can't get there right now, but we're coming. We're coming. And so it really kind of made me think about these kids who live in those home environments where they can't tap out. He had the ability to call somebody to come get him, but so many of the kids that I worked with didn't have a way to tap out. So they lived with the bear outside their tent, or sometimes they lived with the bear inside their tent, violating them over and over and over and over. All the different types of abuse that we just saw, the neglect, physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse. The bear is there with them all the time, and they have no protection from it. They can't get away. They can't call somebody. Occasionally, they're going to act out in school, or sometimes they're acting out in school all the time. That behavior tells us that maybe something's going on. Sometimes they may tell someone that's going on, what's going on. Sometimes they might come to school and have marks or bruises. That's an indicator that something's going on. But a lot of times we don't see those. A lot of times it's coming out as behavior, and we're assuming that the kids are bad, or we're mislabeling them with a mental illness or something like that, when it's actually they are being chronically exposed to adverse childhood experiences in their home. And so what does that do to a kid full time? So when we think about adverse childhood, I'll go back to that slide in just a second. But what I want to point out about these adverse childhood experiences is the study that was done in the 1990s looked at in-home experiences. So it's the types of abuse we talked about, it's the types of neglect we talked about, and it's household dysfunction. And what makes it so, it doesn't have to even be these big traumas, but it's the chronic little bitty traumas that are happening all day, every day. What is that doing to the child's development? What is that doing to the child's brain? What is it doing to the child's body? So how we got the adverse childhood experiences study, it came from the mid-90s through a series of assessments that were done by physicians that were working with some chronically ill patients, and they couldn't understand why their chronically ill patients were not getting better. But they did notice that a lot of their patients talked about early traumatic childhood experiences in their home. So they created a 10-question questionnaire that looked at household abuse, household neglect, household dysfunction, and did those early childhood experiences create these health problems later in life? Now, let me also say that the people that they were doing this research on, half of them were white. Most of them had a high school diploma or college education. And they lived in wealthy neighborhoods in that state. So we're not even talking about people who grow up in extreme poverty or grow up in environments that might be dangerous. We're talking about people that grew up in relatively at least socioeconomically stable households. So this is a picture of the adverse childhood experiences that it looked at. It looked at maternal depression, emotional and sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, homelessness, incarceration, mental illness of someone that was living in the home, divorce, physical and emotional neglect. All of these on top are the traumatic experiences that were happening in the home. But we also know that children are exposed to other types of traumatic experiences. It might be violence in their neighborhood. It might be poor housing quality and affordability when it comes to having safe housing. Maybe lack of opportunity. We've got, when we think about our kids that have these delays, they're, a lot of times they don't have the same opportunities that other kids have, and they're left out. So that leaves them socially isolated. We know about bullying, where they're being verbally and emotionally abused by people in their environment, but it may not actually be going on in their home. Then we have other things like community corruption and discrimination and poverty. And some of these things are the things that our kids are being exposed to. In fact, they may appear in the top. Some of the kids that you guys work with may have wonderful home environments, but it's some of these things down here that they're experiencing. But the original study that was done on the exposure to these, because these are the ones that are the most chronic, and that the kids are more likely to experience long term. And it's the long term nature of these that makes them so fatal. And I say fatal for a reason, because in the study, and we're fixing to do it, there are 10 questions, 10 traumas that you might have been exposed to as a child. And you get 1 point for every trauma that you were exposed to. The higher you get, so 10 is the highest score you can get, the closer you get to 10, the more likely you are to die an early death. So we're fixing to do this real quick, and you're going to score yourself. I'm going to ask you the question and you score yourself. And you don't have to tell me what your score is, but it's good to be aware of your score. And then you can look at some of the habits that you have in your life that can be related to your score, and look at what some of the research talks about as far as like what is the propensity for someone with a score like yours. And it might help maybe propel you in a different direction to make some different choices, especially if you're experiencing some of the chronic health issues that it discusses. So we'll jump in. So question number 1, give yourself 1 point if you say yes to any of these questions. So question number 1, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you were going to be physically hurt? This is that emotional abuse that we talked about, the psychological abuse. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household very often or often push you, grab you, slap you, throw something at you, maybe burn you, hit you, leave marks or bruises, or otherwise injure you? So this is physical abuse. Number 3, did an adult or a person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt to have actual oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? So this is sexual abuse. Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? So this is emotional neglect. Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or too high to take care of you? So that's going to be physical neglect. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? We don't often see that as a big trauma, but that's a pretty significant trauma. And that's a chronic trauma. That's not going to change. So that's something that a child has to go through and then adjust to. Was your mother or stepmother, or even your father, often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them? So this is going to be domestic violence in the home. And it can be, the victim can be the mother or the father. I've, seen a lot of dads that are actually victims of domestic violence as well. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill? And did a household member go to prison? And I think that there's one on here that should have been added that's not on here. And did you have a parent who passed away? That's not on here, but losing a parent is exceptionally hard for children. So add those up and see what your score is. So what they found in this study, they did this study on 17,000 of their patients. 75% of the patients had at least one adverse childhood experience. 20% of patients had at least 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So mind you, these are patients that have chronic illnesses, morbid obesity, they've had bariatric surgeries, they've got high blood pressure, they've got diabetes, they've got all of these chronic illnesses that you're having to get constant treatment for. This is not a cold that you go get, a shot for and take a round of antibiotics. This is a chronic illness that stays with you. And so 75% of those patients had at least exposure to at least one adverse childhood experience. And what did we say about those? They're chronic and in the home. That's where you live in the home with the bear and you can't tap out. You're in, and think about the terror that guy had living in that, in that tent, waiting on them to come in and extract him out. The bear was outside. He lived in terror for 5 hours. So think about that kid who's living in that home, exposed to some type of abuse or neglect or dysfunction that they cannot get out of. And in some cases, it might be extreme physical abuse where they are living in terror. Then we've got 20% of those patients who had 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So it's multiple exposures. And again, these are chronic. This is ongoing. What they found is that the top 5 leading causes of death in the US are connected to the number of ACEs. The higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to die from one of the top 5 leading causes of death. 3 types of cancers are included in that: lung disease and heart disease. Go back to where we talked about when he's in that tent and his heartbeat is just pumping because he's in terror. What does that do to your body when you're living in it for 15 years? When you're constantly exposed to those terrorizing moments and you're living in it constantly, that does something to your body. That's where the high blood pressure comes in and the heart disease comes in and your arteries are hardened. And so that's where the heart disease comes in. But then you've got lung disease, diabetes. What do we do when we're stressed out? Ladies, we eat chocolate and ice cream, right? Then it creates the cyclical pattern of vulnerabilities. We have behavior patterns. In order to cope with the trauma, we start using substances. We have risky behaviors. We develop mental illnesses. They discovered that girls are 3.5 times more likely and boys are 3.8 times more likely to be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence if they experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and their mother was a domestic violence victim. So if you were exposed to physical abuse, sexual abuse, and your mom being abused, then you're 3.5 times more likely to be in an abusive situation yourself. What we have to remember about these kids is that they don't have any control to stop the abuse. So what happens is they develop ways to cope with it or to take advantage of the opportunities that they have. I can't get out of it, so how do I survive it? I can't get out of it, so how do I make the most of it? So substance abuse. As the number of ACEs increases, the likelihood of substance abuse also increases. Promiscuous sex. The higher the ACE score, the higher the number of sexual partners and risky sex in women by age 15. What are they doing? They're being abused at home. They feel unsafe. They feel unseen. They feel unheard. Because the people who are supposed to be keeping them safe, the people that are supposed to be protecting them, are the ones that are hurting them. So who's going to protect me? So they're looking for protection and safety and love in other places. And we get that through sex, or at least that's their perception. So they're looking for love in all the wrong places. We also have an increased suicide attempts. So for children who have experienced child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, and domestic violence, there's those three again. Those three together create a lot of vulnerabilities. So there's a much higher increased risk for suicide. And so being chronically exposed to these creates something called complex trauma. That's going to create some disabilities in children. That's going to create vulnerabilities for predators. And so what we know, according to Maslow, is that in order for us to reach our self-actualization, and in my terms, thriving, we have to have all of these things starting at the very bottom. We have to have all of our physiological needs met. We have to have all of our safety needs met. We have to have all of our belonging and esteem needs met before we can ever get up there to that place of thriving. And so what happens to kids that are exposed to all of these different traumas is the bottom three rungs of this pyramid are stolen from them. They are constantly searching for their physiological needs to be met, their safety needs to be met, and their belonging needs met. The one thing that abuse and neglect in childhood steals from you is your sense of safety. So we're going to be constantly scanning the environment, looking for threats, but also looking for who are we safe with. So trauma-informed care, number one, you have to understand the traumas they're exposed to. Trauma-informed care, number two, safety is their biggest priority. They will put their physiological needs on the back burner in order to feel safe. Those three, the belonging and the safety and the physiological needs, are so interconnected and intertwined that depending on the day, they will sacrifice one to have the other. I have seen children who are in safe foster homes where all their physiological needs are met, run away to go back to a trafficker because he made her feel like she belonged. She risked everything else to go back to him because she felt like she did not belong anywhere. Children in foster care are taken away from abusive parents. And it might not even be children in foster care, but it could be maybe children living with a relative, but it happens a lot in children in foster care. So children in foster care have come from abusive homes. They may have some of the disabilities that we've talked about, which leads to these behavioral challenges in taking care of them and these physical challenges of taking care of them. So they bounce through the foster care system. They'll go to a foster home, stay there a little bit. The placement will disrupt. They'll go somewhere else. Some of these kids have had 50 and 60 placements in foster care. That was my job when I worked for CPS. The last job that I had was trying to find treatment and placement for those kids. And they feel unseen and unheard and unwanted. They have their safety needs met. They're safe. They have their physiological needs met. You know, they have their basic food, clothing, and shelter, but they know that they don't belong anywhere. The parents that were supposed to love them, protect them, didn't. And then those same parents didn't do what was necessary to get them back. So they feel abandoned. And then they come into the system that's supposed to love and take care of them. And they're just told over and over and over and over again, they're too much to handle. And so they're unwanted. So they feel like they don't belong anywhere until this trafficker comes along, until this guy that is sexually exploiting them comes along. And for the first time in their life, they feel like somebody wants them. They feel valuable to somebody. I have a 12-year-old. She's 23 now, but she came into custody when she was 12. She had developmental delays. Her mom was a teenager when she gave birth to her. So, you know, she already at that disadvantage. And then, you know, mom was very neglectful. And so some relatives took custody of her, and they were very emotionally abusive to her and very physically abusive to her. And then they told her it was her fault. Well, you are hard to handle. We didn't know what to do with you, so we just beat the shit out of you with a belt buckle. And we just told you that you were worthless and you were stupid because we didn't know what to do when you were acting out. And so, so she had lots of behavioral challenges. She had lots of developmental delays cognitively, lots of social delays, but she would, instead of going home where she was getting verbally and physically abused, she would just stay out in the neighborhood. And she knew that she was not wanted. She knew that she didn't belong anywhere. She knew that these relatives taking care of her did not love her and that her mama did not love her. And she'll tell you to this day, she's been sexually abused, she's been raped, she's had all these things happen to her, but the biggest hurt of her life is not belonging anywhere and her mother abandoning her. And so because she's avoiding going home, she's staying out in the street. She's 8, 9, 10 years old. And she's being sexually abused by the men and the boys in the neighborhood, but it's positive attention for her. And when, she came into custody when she was 12 and pregnant, and every time that she could get away from the foster home, she'd run away from the foster home and go back to the boyfriend who was 26 that got her pregnant. Because he made her feel like she belonged. And to this day, she's 23 years old. It's been 10 years. She still has contact with him because she has no real contact with anybody in her family. She was in foster care for 10 years. I'm really her only safe person in her life that has anything to do with her. She has exceptional behavioral issues, has been arrested, gets fired from jobs, quits jobs, has a lot of trauma. A lot of this is the way her brain was wired because of the trauma. And when she gets to where she really feels abandoned, she will call him. No, he was not arrested. No, he did not go to prison. And I don't know why. That was not an investigation that I did. She came across my desk when we were looking for placement and treatment for her. And so I had no control over whether or not he was arrested. I don't know who he is. She knows that if I ever found out his name, that I'll turn him into law enforcement. So she's never told me what his name is. She does not have her baby. Her baby was put into foster care, and custody of that baby was given to somebody else. He's 10 years old now. People talk about, kids getting pregnant at 12 and, it's unfair and that they should have an abortion. Well, let me tell you, she was 12. She wanted that baby. And the two biggest traumas of her life was her mama not wanting her, and then CPS not giving her an opportunity to take care of her own child. She called me Sunday because she got to see him on Mother's Day. And just sobbing because she can't have him with her. She's never lived in the same home with him. She's never been able to help take care of him. But y'all, she wants that baby like she wants nothing else. And sometimes he's the only thing that has kept her from committing suicide. Knowing that he's alive, knowing that he is out there, knowing that she has something to live for is the only reason that she's still alive, because she has been suicidal so many times. But she would put her safety at risk in order to feel like she belonged. And she's put her physiological needs at risk because she needed to feel safe. So her brain has been wired where what happens with chronic exposure to these traumas, whether it's in-home traumas or those community traumas, this part of our brain up here is supposed to be what's on when we feel safe. And if we live in a safe environment where there are no bears and we're protected from our families, this part of our brain turns on and we feel safe enough to explore our environment and learn. But when we are living in constantly threatening environments, this part of our brain, our learning brain, turns off. And our survival and basic instinct brain turns on, where our radars are always on and all of our energy is spent scanning the environment for the next threat or trying to plan for How are we going to get our next meal? How are we going to get our needs met? And so your brain stays focused on safety. And so for the girl that I was just telling you about, she'll get a job. She'll be there. Like a really good example was she had this best job she's ever had. She was making about $18 an hour, which was phenomenal. It was a very easy job, but she was eating her lunch and did not finish her lunch. So she left it sitting there to come back and eat later. And one of the managers at the restaurant threw her lunch away. And so she overreacted, which is what she does. That's her brain has hardwired itself to overreact to little bitty stimuli because she's been so exposed to trauma, so exposed to dangerous situations her whole life. She's, her brain is like hardwired to respond in an instant to even little bitty threats. And so her biggest trauma, remember, was being abandoned by her mama and then her son being taken away from her. So abandonment and rejection are two of her biggest triggers. And so in this restaurant, she tells the other manager, she tells on the other guy, she tattles and says, he threw my stuff away. So she throws this big fit. He threw my stuff away. And he did it on purpose. So there's that cognitive distortion that not only did he do it, he did it for mean reasons. So this manager over here is like, I know him. He's not intentionally mean. And so I know he didn't do it for that reason. Her radar goes up. It's already heightened. What she heard was, I'm not seen. I'm not valued. I'm not wanted. You didn't hear me. You didn't value what I had to say, and I'm gone. And so she quits. And she has repeated that pattern for 3 years with every job that she's had. So she puts her physiological needs at risk every time because her brain is constantly seeking safety. She doesn't care if she's living in her car. She's had to live in her car. She doesn't care if she's hungry. What her brain cares about is, am I safe? And for her, it's not physical safety that she's worried about. She can beat the crap out of 5 police officers, and I've seen her do it. It takes that many of them to take her down when she has gotten out of control. So it's not physical safety, it's emotional safety for her. She's been abandoned and rejected so many times that she is hyper vigilant and hyper aware of the slightest little bit of rejection. Any kind of positive criticism, constructive criticism, there have been times where she's not been able to take that at all. I finally have coached her to this place where I can provide her with constructive criticism, but it's taken me 3.5 years to get her to this place because I'm a safe person. I've had to establish that safety with her. And so what they're looking for is a consistent pattern of repetitive activity in a safe environment with a safe person. You establish safety through being consistent, saying what you're going to do and doing it and being consistent with it over time. That's how they know that you're safe. Hearing what they have to say, seeing them. And she has a lot of delays. She has a lot of cognitive delays. She has a lot of self-help delays. She has a speech and language delay, a receptive and expressive language delay. Oftentimes I'll tell her a command or tell her to do something and she feels safe enough with me and she'll say, I don't know what that means. So I have to break it. She's 23 years old and I have to break it down to her on an elementary level. But a lot of people would look at her and give her a command, a complex command, and expect that she's able to do it. And then when she's not, then she's blamed and she's shamed. That triggers the abandonment and rejection response. And so they get this big, huge blow up. And when she gets to a certain point, she's destroying property. But it comes from living in the home with the bear every day for years. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, extreme verbal abuse. And every time these people in her life have apologized, the apology always goes back to, I'm sorry, but you were just so out of control, I didn't know what to do with you. So even in the apology, there's blaming and there's shaming. Complex trauma or complex PTSD comes from that long-term exposure to abuse or neglect. You've got the poly-victimization in there where there's multiple abuse and neglects, there's multiple perpetrators, in home, out of home. And the in-home abuse and neglect leads to vulnerabilities that make outside predators come in. And it creates that brain that is hardwired to operate out of the limbic system and not out of the prefrontal cortex. When they go to school, so this kind of a picture of the body, what happens when the limbic system turns on, when your fight or flight turns on, there are certain parts of your body that shuts down. There are certain parts of your body that are activated. So when that dude had that bear encounter shut down some parts of his body. Like, he does not need to digest food. He does not need to go to the bathroom. He needs to run. So all of his limbs, all the blood is pumping to his limbs and his arms and his legs so that he can run from that bear. He is not, he doesn't need to digest food. He doesn't need to, so some of his organs, not organs necessarily shutting down, but some parts of his body is shutting down. So that's why you see children who struggle with maybe going to the bathroom on themselves, especially at night. Their brains are calming down at night when they're sleeping, and their bodies are starting to turn back on and function like they're supposed to, because the brain is calm and the brain feels safe while they're sleeping. And so then that's when they're going to have accidents at night. Well, then they wake up the next morning and they get abused for having those accidents. So I just looked at the clock. Davelyn, it looks like we are close to 11 o'clock. Was this over at 11?
Yes, ma'am. I
Okay.
would say that for anybody that wants to hear like the rest of the PowerPoint, that is fine. And we'll honor the 9 to 11 o'clock period for CEs. So if you want to finish what you've got, that's okay with me. And for people that need to get off, it's being recorded.
Okay. I've said a lot of some of the stuff that I would say. The things that I would point out is looking at the brain of a child who has experienced the abuse and neglect versus a child who grew up in a healthy environment. You can see in this frontal cortex up here, kind of in the forehead part of the brain, that's your critical thinking brain, that's your executive functioning brain. That's where you can that's what controls impulses. That's what where you're able to kind of weigh the pros and the cons of a situation and kind of critically think through a situation, understanding what the consequences are going to be, kind of projecting to the future, what's going to be the consequence if I do this. In a healthy brain of a child who is in a safe environment, that part of the brain is developed. Going over here to the child that has the coming from an abusive situation where they are chronically abused and neglected, you can see that those parts of the brain are not fully developed. There's a lot of gaps there. And so this is what happens when these kids are chronically exposed to the abuse and neglect, because this part of the brain turns off. When this part of the brain turns off, the neural connections are not being made. So, add that on top of a child who was maybe born with some of these disabilities, and we're going to have a child that's going to have some really exceptional needs. You're going to see ADHD type behavior. You're going to see really impulsive children, children who really struggle with regulating their emotions. And if we're not careful, we're going to misdiagnose them. I assess children in foster care every day. I have the contract with Mississippi to assess kids in foster care to see the level of care that they need. We don't diagnose the children. We go back and get a full trauma history on them from the social worker that can go into their system and see, this is all the investigations we've had on this kid. This is all the types of abuse. Here's, who the perpetrator was. So I can go back and see how long they've been abused and what types of abuse they were exposed to long term. And then I go and I get to read the assessments done by practitioners, psychologists, LCSWs, LPCs, who are out there assessing children. And I can't tell you how much it bugs me when I see the intake say history of abuse and neglect, history of foster care. And then over here, I see a long list of all the problems that the kid has. And then I see a diagnosis, but nowhere in that diagnosis is PTSD. That practitioner has completely minimized everything that kid's been through. They didn't do any kind of looking into the type of abuse, the intensity of the abuse, when did it start, who did it. Those things are important. How long was this kid subjected to this? How long did they live in this environment? And in one situation not too long ago, developmentally delayed child in a sex offenders program, he has poor impulse control when it comes to sexually abusing other people and masturbating in public. So I call, get the history on him. Extreme sexual abuse as a child that started very early. Extreme verbal abuse by the mama that we have on file as reported by a pediatrician who saw him being and overheard him being verbally abused in her office. Extreme neglect. So he has lived in kind of this torturous situation for probably the first 8 years of his life, 10 years of his life. So chronic exposure, right? So then he starts sexually offending. He's taken into foster care, but multiple reports of abuse and neglect. Now he's in this treatment program. He's been there for almost 6 months. And I'm talking to the therapist, and she says, well, he's been a lot more aggressive lately. I said, well, tell me more about that. Well, he's just been attacking staff, and that's just coming out of the blue. Well, nothing just comes out of the blue, something triggers it. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And she's like, well, we've kind of looked at it, and it's happening with certain staff, certain times of the day. Will tell me more about that. And so she's telling me that he has started hallucinating. He is hearing voices. I said, well, whose voice is he hearing? He's hearing his mama's voice. Okay, well, what is mama telling him? Mama's telling him that he's worthless. Mama's telling him that he's unloved, that nobody wants him, that he's stupid, and then tells him to hurt people. Well, when did he start hearing these voices? Well, about 3 weeks ago. I said, well, what happened before he started hearing the voices? Well, his uncle got onto him. Well, why did the uncle get onto him? Well, because he was fighting the staff. Well, when did he start fighting the staff? About 2 weeks before that. I said, well, what happened to make him start fighting the staff? Well, he started fighting the staff at night because he didn't want to go to sleep. Well, why doesn't he want to go to sleep? Because he's starting to have nightmares. Well, when did the nightmares start? After we started trauma therapy. So they were wanting to, so because they didn't have his abuse and neglect history, they had the history that he was sexually abused, but not the verbal abuse. They were seeing him hearing these voices as hallucinations. And I said, I really doubt they're hallucinations. And I'm wondering if they're not more either the intrusive thoughts or the flashbacks from when his mama was verbally and sexually abusing him. Because for all these years, when they have to, I have a friend who is a sex trafficking survivor, and this is how she put it to me. She's been sexually abused and sexually trafficked since she was 9 to age 29. And she said, Holly, when I was living in it, I had to stuff it and numb it. She said, so I stuffed it and I numbed it and I dissociated and I used drugs. She said, so all those memories were way down deep and way down low, and I didn't really think about them because I could cover them up with the dissociation and the numbing and the drugs. Well, when she was rescued and she was sent to treatment, she had to get off the drugs. Well, whatever the drugs was covering up is now coming up, and she don't have the drugs to cope with it. And then she's in therapy, and now all these memories are coming up. So she's having to process them in therapy, which brings more memories. She said, so all of these old demons, these old memories that she had stuffed for so many years are now coming out because of this trauma therapy. So that made me think about this kid. Now, my friend Haley is 33 years old. She can understand what is happening to her. This kid is 16 and developmentally delayed, cognitively developmentally delayed. You know, IQ is like 68. All he knows is that he's talked about being sexually abused in trauma therapy with his therapist, and now it has triggered these nightmares. And now he didn't want to go to sleep. And so he fights staff at bedtime so that he doesn't have to go to sleep. And because he's fighting staff, he's getting into trouble. And so his uncle, who is his soon-to-be guardian, comes up there and gets on to him. Well, that triggers the verbal abuse. This criticism triggers the verbal abuse from mama. So now he's having hallucinations of hearing mama, or is it hallucinations? I think it's probably more of flashbacks. Flashbacks, when you describe a flashback, it's like you were there reliving the trauma. If you've ever watched the movie American Sniper, he's sitting in his living room and his wife is talking to him, but he's not there. He is back on a battlefield fighting for his life. Bombs are going off, and you see the vision in his head. Well, this kid is talking about these visions he's seeing in his head of his mama telling him these things. So I have to ask you, is he hallucinating or is it a flashback? And because he's delayed, I think we're going to have some struggles with maybe deciphering which one it is. But because they didn't have his full trauma history, they were much more willing to give him, a diagnosis of psychosis or schizophrenia than they were to give him a diagnosis of trauma or complex trauma. So these trauma histories and being trauma informed and really doing a thorough trauma assessment are really important when we're working with these kids. This exposure to trauma is going to have behavioral impacts. When they are in fight, flight, or freeze mode, they're going to be running away and fighting and dissociating and numbing and cutting, and they're going to have attention issues and daydreaming, and they're going to quit and they're going to run. They're not going to live places long. They're not going to trust anybody. They're going to be irrational. They're going to be irate. They're going to be super impulsive. Add that on top of the delays and disabilities that they already have. And we can see why that will create opportunities for them to be abused and neglected more. They're going to have trouble regulating their emotions. Some of them were like with my 23-year-old, she was already struggling with regulating her emotions because of the extreme neglect in year 0 to 3. Year 0 to 3, that's when she was living with her mom, who was a teenager who didn't know how to take care of her. So there was extreme neglect there. She didn't bond with a caregiver. So now she does not know how to emotionally regulate. That was causing the 3 to 4-year-old, when she was 3 to 4-year-old, to start being abused by these new caretakers in her life because they didn't know how to handle her emotional dysregulation. So they just beat her. And that just creates this open door for her to be verbally and physically abused more by these caretakers. And so now she's 23 years old, and the smallest little bitty criticism sends her way over the edge, and she's been arrested. Now we're having trouble getting her apartments because we're having trouble with her maintaining employment, and she's got a criminal record now. And we are trying to, over time, build safety in her, establishing this safe relationship with her. Her brain is finally feeling safe. We're talking through some of these issues. I've built this foundation of safety with her to where she feels comfortable coming to me and saying, hey, I messed up. How can I do this differently? She's gained so much insight because she has someone in her life that she feels safe with. I'm not her therapist. I don't do therapy with her. I'm just that safe relationship that she should have had when she was an infant. She feels comfortable to come to me and tell me everything because she knows that I'm not going to blame her. I'm not going to shame her. And we're going to talk through it. And she calls me in the middle of the night. She calls me in the middle of the morning. I'm just always there for her. And so that's what it takes. And is it frustrating? Yes. Does it cross professional boundaries? You can say that it does. But at the same time, my goal for her is to thrive. And what trauma research tells us is that prior to me establishing this relationship with her, the state of Mississippi probably spent $1 million on her. $1 million when she was in foster care. Psychiatric residential treatment at the cost of $400 a day for most of her time. And that didn't include the medications. What has helped her brain heal is feeling safe. And she didn't feel safe in any of those institutions. She had all of her physiological needs met. She was getting food, she was getting therapy, she was getting medication, and most of the time she's being over medicated because that was the only way they could control her behavior. What has got her to this point where she can somewhat hold down a job, where she is building relationships for the first time, is having somebody in her life that she feels safe with. And she's finally learning all these things that she wasn't able to learn when she was little because she was constantly scanning the environment for the next threat. We're working on getting her an apartment. She's door dashing. Perfect job for her. She does not have to interact with anybody else in the workplace. And she has earned really great rewards through DoorDash as one of their top dashers. And so she's making almost $100 a day now. Fantastic. She just paid off her car. She did that. She had to live in it for a few months, but she just paid off her car. And she has no family helping her. None. And so it has taken somebody building a safe, predictable, and consistent relationship with her, always being there for her when she needs me. That's what it takes to rewire the brain. Because the limbic system turns off, prefrontal cortex turns on, and those neural connections can then start to be created. So has she gotten to where she needs to be? No, but she's way better than she was 5 years ago. It's been a long time since she's been arrested. It's been a long time since she's destroyed property somewhere. She's gone through some really stressful things in the last 8 months, and she's overcome it without getting arrested, without destroying property. And so it's the small, my expectations of her, because that's the key, is having the realistic expectations of these kids and what their abilities and disabilities are and what the trauma has done. So all of that compounds to create all of these challenges. You have to have the right expectations of them because they're going to have lots of struggles. And if we have unrealistic expectations, then they're not going to make it. Safety, making them feel safe is key. You have to expect delays. You have to expect that they're not going to change in 6 months. They're not going to change in a year. You have to expect that it's going to take years for their brain to rewire. Haley was rescued when she was 29 from sex trafficking. She's 34 now. She's going into year 4 of being rescued. And her night terrors have just now stopped. She's just now gotten to this place where she could potentially hold down a job and provide for herself. And yet we have these expectations that survivors who don't have exceptional needs and disabilities are supposed to go to a treatment program, be better in 60 days, and be self-sufficient. That's totally not trauma informed. When we think about our programs, our domestic violence shelters, our human trafficking shelters, our substance abuse treatment centers, to have this expectation that these people are supposed to just have their shit together in 90 days and then go out there and be self-sufficient and keep it all together and not fall back and not go back to their trafficker. What we're doing is we're setting them up to fail when we create our programs to be that short of a time frame, because it takes a hell of a lot longer than 90 days for the brain to heal. A lot longer. And if you've worked with any of these survivors for a long period of time, you see these challenges that they have. They have challenges with learning. They have challenges with emotional regulation. They have challenges with sleeping through the night. When you have night terrors all night, you get no sleep, but you're expected to get up the next morning and have a job and take care of yourself and be able to make enough money to pay rent on your own. And because you have emotional regulation issues, it's going to cause issues with the law. That's probably going to give you a criminal record. But we're expecting them to be able to get a job and find housing and have good credit and all those things. And I think we just have an unrealistic expectation, and the brain science behind trauma proves, when we look at our systems and our programs and how they're designed, they are not aligned with what the science tells us happens to the brain when we have this chronic exposure to trauma. Add on top of that the delays that some of these kids have. So it's going to take all of us together advocating and understanding. You need to be as trauma informed as you can so that you can be advocating for your clients for the right types of system approaches that are data supported. It's time that we change the system so that they can thrive. So that is all that I have. I'm going to put my little card up there. That is my email address. You can follow me on Facebook or Instagram. And then that's my phone number. And let me get over here.
I love those last 2 lines. I think so much of that, all of it was incredible. All of the things that you said were incredible and so useful. But that last part about us being informed and the versus the system and what the system's capable of, that's so important. And it's good information. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Really,
does anybody have any questions before we hop off?
Please, if there are any questions. You're kind of keeping up with the chats we're getting, asking about a website that leads to trauma. If you have any recommendations, we're getting compliments from as well.
So what I would say, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a wealth of knowledge on how they have assessment tools, they have programs. If you're looking for grants, if you're looking for programs that have worked, evidence-based programs, evidence-based tools, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network is a great place to go. If you're looking to be more informed about things like human trafficking, you can go to the Polaris Project. Also the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. You can get a lot of information on there. Some of the other training that I offer is on online child sexual exploitation and sextortion. And I also do a presentation called Praying in the Pews, and that's on sexual predators in the community. Children with disabilities are exceptionally vulnerable to those types of predators for various reasons. And so there's, I could talk for days on the online sexual exploitation of children and child sex predators. And so, but definitely visit the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They have a lot of tools and stuff on there. The Polaris Project, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, are all very good websites to go to and utilize.
There is an interesting question. You may have some input on here. In my school, I'm told to stay in my lane. How can we change this attitude?
You're told to stay in your lane.
Because they're not a counselor, is what it sounds like.
Oh, like a school counselor. I'm going to say that I've gotten fired for standing up for kids and standing up against programs that I didn't believe in. So I'm not sure that's the answer you wanted. But if you think that it's the right thing to do, don't let anybody tell you not to do it, is what I would say.
I think this is a good answer.
If you recognize that something is not right, and that's eventually why I ended up leaving CPS, because the program that I was asked to do, I did it really well. And we were seeing lots of improvements in kids, and the administration at the time saw it and appreciated it. And then we were in a lawsuit settlement agreement at the time. And the plaintiffs in that lawsuit went to the governor and said, hey, look, we don't like the administration that's there. Get rid of that administration, or we're going to take you back to federal court. So the governor got rid of the administration that was supportive of the program that I had. And the new administration that came in was not supportive of the program that I had. And we had a number of children, all of them with emotional disabilities and physical disabilities. And one child had been in foster care for 17 years. We took her into custody when she was a year old. We destroyed her, right? The abuse that she was exposed to as an infant did not cause all the delays that she had. That was caused by the 80 foster care placements that she experienced in foster care. And so, what the program that I implemented, what I knew about trauma, what I just learned about trauma, was that it takes a safe, supportive relationship. And what did those children were bouncing from place to place to place to place to place. Yeah. So you can't have a supportive relationship with anybody because you're not staying in any place long enough. And so she had nobody, and she had nobody for years. And so she was in a treatment facility and had been there for 2 or 3 years. And they called and said, Hollie, it's she was failure to thrive as a 17-year-old. And she said, she's not even getting out of the bed anymore, and she's not eating. And I had nowhere else to send her. And so I started sending one of my workers to see her twice a week. We stepped her down to a lower level of care within 6 months. She had been in foster care for 17 years. She'd been in every treatment facility in Mississippi. She had all types of medications. She had, she was probably a $2 million kid if I went back and added up all the stuff that we spent on her. But none of that mattered when nobody gives a shit about you. Why do you want to live if nobody cares about you? And that was her life. And so I sent my worker to go visit her. And my office was not the regular social worker. It was not our job to go visit the kids. That was the regular social worker's job. But the regular social worker was seeing her for 10 minutes and leaving. Nobody was spending quality time with her. So I sent my worker to spend quality time with her twice a week. And in 6 months, we had her step down in a lower level of care. That worker continued to go and see her twice a week. She was adopted when she was 20. That worker is still in that girl's life, because I told her, I said, once you start visiting her and being in her life, you can never come out of her life. You will be attached to her forever. Are you willing to do this?
Yeah.
And she said yes. And to this day, this girl is probably about 22 or 23 right now. That worker still goes and sees her. And that child was adopted at the age of 20 because she had been able to build a safe relationship with my worker.
Right.
And so when they told me that I couldn't do that anymore, I left. I could not stay at a place that would not allow me to do the right thing.
Yeah. What a difference a time investment makes. And yeah, sometimes you have to stand when it's hard.
Yeah. And so that's why I eventually got to this place, because I was like, if I work for myself, I can say what I want to say.
Yeah.
And I can do what I want to do.
Right.
And I can do it the right way.
Yeah.
And I can say it the way that it needs to be said.
Yeah.
And not worry about politics. Because I have to go back to who called me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
I am not afraid of anybody at this point, because God called me to do this.
Yeah.
And he put this passion in me. If it gets me in trouble, so be it. There's not a lot they can take from me at this point. I live in a 27-foot camper. Like if you feel the need to come get my camper, the skylight is leaking. So sometimes you may have to decide what's more important, and you may actually have to give up something,
right,
to stand for something.
Absolutely.
That's what I would say.
Yeah. So one of our participants wants to know if you're from Natchez, Mississippi.
I'm not.
Oh, okay.
But Natchez is pretty cool. They have good food there and really cool places there. I've been there a lot.
You have. Someone has posted, I often question if schools are trauma informed.
No, they're not.
Right. Stop right there. I know.
They're not. But I would say CPS is not trauma informed. Law enforcement is not trauma informed. Or we've gotten to this place where people are now trauma informed, but they're not trauma practicing. There's a whole difference between being trauma informed and trauma practicing. Trauma practicing is now taking that knowledge and changing our program to make our program fit with what the data says, which is why I brought up like domestic violence shelters and human trafficking programs and drug treatment programs. When we know what the trauma does to the brain and we look at a 30-day program, we have to see that 30-day program really doesn't do a whole lot for that victim.
Mm-hmm.
It gives them a safe place for 30 days, but they are not prepared to just be thrown out there to be self-sufficient. Their brain is going to have to be hardwired. So there's a gap between the 30-day safety and thriving. And my role here is to find how do we fill the gap between them coming out of the 30-day program and them thriving. Because in that gap is where they're going back to their trafficker, they're going back to their abuser, or they're committing suicide.
Right. Yeah.
There are high rates of suicide with these survivors.
Yeah. That response was true. No trauma practice that you use. I would say the link to the survey in the chat. You can still ask if you need. So we still have about 67 people on. Thank you for staying on. If you've stayed on, we appreciate you. Say if you have any questions, you're still welcome to ask those. Hollie, people have stayed on because it's that good. It's
good.
I think that trauma informed care and trauma are buzzwords right now. And that's okay if it means like pushing the needle towards what we need to be doing. So I really appreciate everything that you've shared, your wisdom and experiences, because that'll help other people make better decisions
Thank y'all. Thank y'all for having me. Thank y'all for being attentive and listening to my stories. And, thank you for critically thinking through some of your questions. And, I hope that you're able to kind of critically look at your work environment and maybe go forward with how do we create a trauma practicing environment. I do have trauma informed schools training. It's a 2-day training that I do, and I bring in some other professionals. I've done that at the Clinton schools here and can send you references from them. They have loved it and had lots of great things to say about it. And then I tweak it just a little bit, and I have trauma informed organizations. And so it's similar to what I just went through, but then I have an expert that comes in and he really breaks down the brain science and the body science and goes into deep detail of here's what this does to the brain. Here's why you're seeing the behaviors that you're seeing. And then I bring in Haley, who is my human trafficking survivor, and she walks through, okay, I've lived this. This is how my brain now operates. This is how it operated as a kid. These are the behaviors you would have seen from me. Here's the challenges I have now as a survivor. And then we walk through what are your current policies and practices as an organization, and how does that need to change? Like if you're an organization that hands out a pamphlet to trauma survivors and says, here's a list of all of our resources, good luck. They're not going to access those resources because unknown equals unsafe. That's one thing that I didn't say. Unknown is unsafe. If this is an unknown organization with an unknown person, my brain considers that unsafe and I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to try that. I'm not going to reach out to these unknown organizations because my brain is trying to protect me from unsafe situations. That's why you'll see them go back to a trafficker, back to the bear, because Haley will tell you, I'd rather be with the devils I know than the devils I don't know. I know how to survive those devils. I don't know how to survive these new devils over here. Our environment is a safe environment for us. It's not a safe environment for her because she's often blamed and shamed and not believed. So we are the new devils in her life and we make her very uncomfortable, but she knows how to survive the traffickers. She knows how to survive those devils. And the only reason she has not gone back to them is because she knows that they will kill her. But how many other trafficking survivors have gone back to the devils that they know? Because the devils over here, us, are unknown and unsafe. Mm-hmm. So your brain sees unknown as unsafe. So when you hand a pamphlet of unknown resources that they've never dealt with people they've never dealt with places they've never been, they're not going to follow through. So you have to reassess as an advocate with those organizations. They really do need to go to these services. So like with Destiny, my 23-year-old, I not only say, I will sit there with her and call this place, or I will go with her to that place. I go with her to her therapy appointments because she does not want to go alone. So I'll go with her to something 3 or 4 or 5 times until she feels comfortable and it's become a safe place for her to where she'll go by herself. But if I just hand it to her to go do on her own, she's not going to do it. Her brain's not going to let her. That's what I'm talking about when we start to become trauma practicing. So I come in and do that training. It's a full day, 2 full days of training with me and a couple of other professionals. So, and we're affordable. So.
Awesome. I did see another question. Any recommendations for foster parents? That's the question, but I would imagine in kids that have been impacted by trauma, I'm sure they all are. And if they're
gonna test you to see if you're safe. They're gonna test you and see if you're consistent. They're gonna test you and see if you do what you say you're gonna do and be who you say you're gonna be. They're going to test you. And so are you always going to be there for them? Are you always going to love them even when they're being a butthole? And Destiny does that with me. And she'll beg me not to leave her, and then she'll turn around and cuss me out. And then she'll turn around and apologize. And, you know, we've had that conversation. I understand because I'm trauma informed and I know that she's triggered when she says these things. And I also know that 30 minutes later, when her brain calms down and her rational brain turns back on, she's going to be apologetic. And when this part of her brain comes back on, we can actually process what happened and go through it. The brain has to have time to rewire itself. So when they first get to your house, you're a new situation, you're an unknown situation. So their radars are going to be up and they're going to act out more in the beginning. But the more they feel safe with you, the more you'll see their behaviors kind of die down. They want to be seen and known and heard. Seen, known, and heard. There's a quote that comes from Tim Keller. He says, to be loved but unknown is great but superficial. That's when people love us but they don't really know us. So you really can't say that that's real love. To be fully known, where you really know who I am, but then you reject me and you don't love me, is our worst fear. You know everything about me and you throw me away. Our worst fear. But to be fully known, you fully know who I am, all my scars, all my deep, dark secrets, all my demons, and you fully love me too. That's like being loved by God. And that's what every soul desires. And over and over and over and over again, when I've worked with these kids, they always say, they don't see me. They don't hear me, which tells them they're not valued. They're not wanted. And so a lot of times people will say, she gets emotionally dysregulated when she's told no. Well, let's break down the no. How many abandonments has she had in her life? The people who were supposed to love her didn't. The people who were supposed to protect her didn't. But even worse with Destiny, her mama went on to have 6 more kids. Her mama raised those kids. She didn't want Destiny. So that's even bigger hurt. So when you tell Destiny no, the no has a much bigger meaning. It's not that Destiny's spoiled. Destiny's never been spoiled a day in her life. That no tells her, you don't value me. Just like the manager in the restaurant, when she told on the other guy and said, he did this and it hurt my feelings, this manager over here said, it's not that big of a deal. It was a big deal to her. And so that told her, I can't trust him to see me and value me. So when you're a foster parent to these kids that have a lot of abandonment, who've been abused, your no means much more than no. Your no means, I don't value you. So find another way to say no. Find a different way to say no. Not right now. I can't at the moment, but I hear that this is something that's very important to you. Let's talk about this. It takes away the sting of the rejection. And rejection is a huge trigger for children in foster care.
Those are really, really good points, and good suggestions for someone who is in the capacity as a parent or as a foster parent. That's really good. Okay, so I don't know this acronym, but somebody was asking what you do and what allows you to be able to intervene in CPI cases. I'm not familiar with the
Maybe just CPS cases.
Maybe so.
I
guess worker.
So I do a lot of different things actually. So ACE Institute is a training and consulting company. So part of what I do is I train you guys. My training is based off of 20 years of experience of either investigating child abuse, working with parents, or later in my CPS career, I was evaluating children in foster care and what their needs were and trying to find a placement for them. Now I have a contract with CPS to evaluate those kids and determine the level of care they need to be in. That's a federal requirement now, that if children have to be in a higher level of care, the federal government is requiring that an independent contractor assess those kids to see if, because foster care is notorious for putting kids in group homes because there's not enough foster homes. And the feds are saying they need to be in foster homes, not in group homes. Foster care, group homes are way more expensive and kids deserve a family. So we will cut off funding if you put them in a group home and there is no justification for them to be there. So I do the assessments. My company does the assessments on the kids to see if they need that level of care. So that's how I'm able to, you know, kind of stay kind of ahead of the game, and because we are assessing these kids all day, every day, and seeing what's kind of missed and what's, you know, your average mental health practitioner is not digging deep enough. And so they're often misdiagnosed. And if they're misdiagnosed, they're not getting the treatments that they need. And, you know, we're seeing them cycle through all of these treatment centers because we're interviewing the social workers, we're interviewing the treatment centers to see what their past traumas were, but then also what their current behaviors are. And so we're just kind of seeing all these traumas accumulate over time with these kids that are in foster care. And then I also do some consulting work for a civil litigation attorney. There's a attorney because justice does not always come through the criminal justice system, right? For them to go and be found guilty in the criminal justice system, they have to be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by a jury of 12 people. And so there's a lot of child sexual abuse and child trafficking that goes on, or even severe physical child abuse that does not get prosecuted because of various issues with the criminal justice system, but you can still seek justice civilly. So if the alleged offender, or if the offender has a lot of assets, if it was a teacher or a school district, like I see a lot of times where it happens a bunch in churches too, where like there was a big case in Texas that just hit the news last week or 2 weeks ago, where they had a known registered sex offender. They were sending kids to his house because they believed he was safe. And it was a campus ministry, a college campus ministry, and they would take their students to this guy's house, and he was a known sex offender. And he molested kids that were brought to his house, even after he was convicted of being a sex offender and was on the sex offenders registry. So I work with a civil attorney who takes cases like that, and I build rapport with law enforcement and do some kind of digging in those cases, because oftentimes those offenders have hundreds of victims. And so it's just a matter of digging and finding where they've been, where they've worked, and stuff like that. So I do some of that investigative work on the side for that attorney.
Wow, that's a lot that you're doing, and we appreciate it. I think there's something that I missed, and then I guess we'll call this. How do you correct the undesirable behavior of young children without damaging them further? I know that the connection was broken. I don't know how much of that you heard. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Consistency. When it comes to any kind of discipline, you have to set appropriate boundaries. So you can't, like with Destiny, when she gets angry and she starts yelling at me and cussing me, I hang up on her. I will not allow her to abuse me. And so it's okay to set appropriate boundaries. It's okay to discipline them. The key is being consistent. Even children with disabilities can learn consistency. It's repetitive patterns. And so, and they may say they hate you. They may say that you're abusing them. But not all discipline is abuse. And so it's just a matter of being consistent. The challenge with children with disabilities is that you have to be a lot more persistent at being consistent than you would, because it may take them longer to learn that this is not acceptable behavior, but they eventually will learn. It's just, you're just going to have to do it every single time. If you are inconsistent where you hold them accountable this time, but then they get away with it 5 times, that's not consistency, and you're going to see the behavior continue. You're going to have to be consistent with it every single time until the behavior is changed.
That's really good. It's simple, but
It's simple, but it's hard.
Right, yeah.
Because you have to do it in the grocery store, and you have
Yeah.
to do it when you're at Walmart, and you have to do it while you're at church, and you have to do it while you're at home, and you have to do it, and it can be really inconvenient. Consistency is inconvenient.
It's true.
Making threats is easy, but
Right,
being consistent and following through is inconvenient. And you have to be willing to be inconvenienced for a shorter amount of time so that the behavior is learned, and then you move on to the next thing.
right.
So.
I can't tell you how much I you being with us today, and for all of the that you shared with us. For anybody that is still on here, thank you again, Holly, for joining. She's got her contact information there. We will not out the PowerPoint, but this webinar was recorded YouTube channel, and we will send information out about that in the coming days. If you have any questions or need anything, you're welcome to contact me. Our contact information, I'm going to put my email in, but then it should also be with the email that you received when you signed up for this webinar. Lots of compliments, lots of thanks in the chat, Holly. So we really appreciate your time. We do have the evaluation link in the chat as well. So please take that so that we can.
Y'all leave very constructive comments. Like it doesn't hurt my feelings to get constructive criticism, because that's how I get better. That's how I get better. So
we
I'm here
appreciate
to serve y'all.
The honest feedback. We need it too. So yes, please provide honest feedback to us. And I just can't tell you thank you enough. I don't have appropriate words for how much I appreciate all this. Really.
Yeah. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for what you do for these kids, because this is hard work.
It is.
It's really hard work. And y'all see hard things. And not everybody is equipped to see hard things and do hard things. And so I'm thankful for y'all, and God bless y'all. And I'll see y'all next time.
Thank you so much, Holly. We appreciate you.
You too.
Y'all have a good afternoon.
Stop sharing.